The Prime Minister of Canada has invoked rarely used emergency powers against the ongoing truckers' protest. It's only the second time in Canadian history that such powers have been invoked in peacetime. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau used the Emergencies Act to address the blockades and occupations, but ruled out using the military. Trudeau says the emergency measures are time-limited and geographically targeted, but that authorities would be guaranteed more powers to arrest protesters and seize their trucks in order to clear blockades. Funding for the protests will also be banned.
After discussing with Cabinet and caucus, after consultation with premiers from all provinces and territories, after speaking with opposition leaders, the federal government has invoked the Emergencies Act to supplement provincial and territorial capacity to address the blockades and occupations. I want to be very clear. The scope of these measures will be time-limited, geographically targeted, as well as reasonable and proportionate to the threats to address.
The Canadian Parliament would have to approve the use of the emergency measures within 7 days, but it also has the power to revoke them. In addition to providing police resources, Canada will broaden the scope of its anti-money laundering and terrorist financing rules to cover crowdfunding platforms. All crowdfunding programs and payment providers need to register with Canada's anti-money laundering agency. The government will also allow banks to temporarily freeze the accounts of those suspected of supporting the blockades without obtaining a court order. This act has been put in place with immediate effect. At the border between Canada's Alberta and the American state of Montana, Canadian police have arrested at least 11 protesters with rifles, handguns, body armour and ammunition. This is just a day after another key US-Canada border crossing was cleared in Ontario. Truckers and other protesters heard about the emergency powers but remained at the protest site. Hundreds of trucks are also still clogging the streets of the capital, Ottawa. For the past 2 weeks, hundreds of protesters in trucks have been railing against vaccine mandates. Ontario has been the epicentre of protests. Demonstrators have been calling for the lifting of the health measures. The Premier of Ontario has now announced to lift vaccine passport requirements in the Canadian province. The easing curbs follows higher vaccination numbers, and the peak of cases sparked by the Omicron variant has now passed in the country. The easing of Ontario health measures will start on February 17th. All capacity limits will be removed except for sporting events, concert venues and theatres. These will be capped at 50%, while some higher risk settings will also be capped at 25%, while the vaccine passport itself will be removed by March the 1st. Amid the ongoing truckers' protests, another group has taken to the streets of Vancouver to mark the 31st annual demonstration in honour of Indigenous women and girls who were murdered or have disappeared in Canada over the decades. But the protest took a slightly disruptive turn in the city of Vancouver. A group of demonstrators toppled a controversial statue of John Dayton, kicking it and covering it with red paint. Local media says the statue is also referred to as Gassy Jack, a British-born bar owner in Vancouver who married a Squamish woman first and later her 12-year-old niece. Scores turned out on the streets to demand action, transparency and information about their missing loved ones. According to Women's Memorial March organisers, the route made stops to commemorate where women were last seen or found. The march originated after the murder of an Indigenous woman in 1992, after which it was found that Indigenous women, girls and transgender people disproportionately continued to go missing or be murdered in Canada, and minimal to no action were taken to address the systemic nature of gendered violence, poverty, racism or colonialism.